Welcome back to Hardball. Well, how many Republicans will vote for Barack Obama come November? Will it be enough to help Obama win this thing? With us now, two leaders of Republicans for Obama, former Iowa Congressman Jim Leach and longtime Republican philanthropist and fundraiser Rita Hauser. Ms. Hauser, thank you for joining us. I'm told by our researchers that your chief reason for splitting with the Republicans this time out is the war in Iraq and your view of that campaign.
Yes, that's absolutely right, Chris, and I'm glad to see you back and well.
Thank you.
Yes,
well,
I think I speak for a very large number of Republicans who did not find this going to war and the way it was conducted as normal type activity for traditional Republicans. You fight when you're attacked and when you're seriously threatened, not go off on adventures. What's important is that McCain shows no sign of being willing to wind down our commitment in Iraq, being willing to address the problems seriously that have been caused by our commitment in Iraq, like doing the right thing in Afghanistan, Pakistan. And he says bluntly that he will stay there until 2012 or 2013, and that is not acceptable to a very large number of Republicans and former Republicans who now call themselves independents.
Okay, Congressman Leach, you've been a long-time Republican member of the House. You're a member of the House Republican Caucus, a loyal member of the party, and here you are endorsing the Democratic candidate for president.
Well, first, I'm no longer a member of Congress. I'm a private citizen, non-office holding. But I think any sense of perspective has to indicate that America has gone through a rather tough patch. And the fact of the matter is that we have diplomatically, economically, militarily been behind the eight ball in an increasing degree for each of the past 4 or 5 years. And the question is, do we want a new direction? And do we want a new direction rooted in historical American values, or one that's what might be described as aberrational, that is unusual, in which we attack countries that haven't attacked us, in which we lay plans for long-term occupation of a land where America and the West are deeply resented? It's time for a change, and I think that change has to come quickly.
Who would Abraham Lincoln support in this race, Congressman Leach?
Well, that's a good question. Abraham Lincoln opposed a war in 1848 against Mexico. He then led this country on the greatest civil rights issue in the history of man, ending slavery. But I will say this, it's always presumptuous to think of anybody in the historical setting, but Abraham Lincoln would insist that every American vote for the best candidate, irregardless of color, of skin. And that is where the great Republican tradition resides.
Are you afraid, Ms. Hauser, that despite his maverick reputation, that John McCain, Senator McCain, the presumptive Republican nominee, is as much enthralled with the neoconservative philosophy of foreign adventurism, as your word, of what's it called? They have a word for it. I forget what it is. I think it's preventive war, which means go to war to prevent a war. Yes. I'm not sure what the logic is. Do you think he's as much a thinker in that regard as George W. Bush became?
And then even more so. In all of his statements, there's no question about it, we would have Bush 3. And I think a lot of people are very nervous about that, including large segment of Republicans. This war has never been paid for properly. In fact, it hasn't been accounted for. And we don't know the extent of what it is costing and what damage it's doing to our economy. So that's another reason Republicans like to balance their books. They like to be managerial correct, and they like to know what they're getting themselves into. I also want to speak as a woman. There are very large numbers of Republican women for choice. And McCain the other night at the Faith Forum presented himself as the most pro-life senator in the Congress, and one who would seek to repeal Roe v. Wade and would put various justices on the court to try to do that. That's not acceptable. We have never had an appropriate place at the table of this President Bush for those Republicans who are for choice, and they are a very large segment of the Republican Party.
Let me ask you, I want to ask you both about the number of people you believe you represent going into November. In 2004, the last presidential election, 6% of self-identified Republicans voted for John Kerry. 11% of Democrats voted for President Bush. Mr. Leach, it seems to me that people tend to go back to their party flock by the time election comes. Do you think there'll be a significant double-digit number of Republicans who choose Obama?
Well, first, I would never presume to ask anyone to think the way I think or to vote the way I do. But I will tell you the largest block of unrepresented Americans in the Congress today is a great common sense middle, whether they be Republicans or Democrats. Our parties have skewed somewhat to the outside. And so the question is, where is the great American common sense movement today? And my strong sense is that it's what Barack Obama is trying to articulate, a capacity to work with all sides, a capacity to lead America as a consensus candidate. And I think if you think it through about the need for change, but change rooted in values that tap both Republican and Democratic traditions, that's a very compelling argument.
I'd like to say, Chris, that I think that number will double and then some. And I think it will be a very important vote in the crucial battleground states like Virginia and Colorado and Jim's Iowa and in North Carolina, in places where many Republicans are very disquieted by the policies of Bush to be continued in spades by John McCain.
Well, I think a lot of people think like both of you. The question whether they can break from the tendency to be lemmings and think for themselves the way you do, because I think you do. Both of you represent traditional American foreign policy and values. Don't tread on me. We only attack when we're attacked. Right. We don't start wars. That's America. And I completely agree with you. And I'm allowed to say so. Jim Leach, thank you. Rita Hauser, thank you both.